You know, in the past couple of years in the MMORPG landscape, it's been really negative. It seems like every new major release in the genre gets a ton of criticism before the game even comes out. What's the endgame like? Is combat boring? What classes can I play? Is there enough content? Tends to be a lot of the questions that fans will ask. Sometimes the criticism is completely uncalled for, while other times it's completely warranted. It almost seems lucky that companies even bother with major MMORPG releases nowadays, since it seems like everyone comes into these games with such incredibly high expectations, but alas, that is where we are in the landscape. Any new MMORPG that comes out, unfortunately, has decades of other juggernaut titles that it will be compared to, with today's game being no different. Throne in Liberty is the new MMORPG on the block. It's a new free-to-play sandbox MMO developed by NCSoft and published here in the West by Amazon Games. Now, Amazon Games hasn't had a long history of publishing MMOs so far, but NCSoft, on the other hand, has published or developed a ton of great MMO titles. Games like City of Heroes, Guild Wars, and WildStar are some of the heavy hitters NCSoft has had a part in, with one particular title putting them on the map, that title being Lineage. Lineage is an MMORPG that isn't really talked about much here in the West, but it's arguably one of the MMO juggernauts that started the renaissance of Korean developers in the genre. Essentially, the Lineage series laid the groundwork for how a lot of Korean developed MMORPGs are structured in terms of their gameplay and systems. Crazy to think about, considering it's almost never referred to here in the West, but in the Eastern markets, it was and still is an incredibly huge name. Now, Throne in Liberty apparently takes place within the Lineage universe, as it was originally announced as Lineage Eternal all the way back in 2011. Obviously, a decade later, Lineage Eternal was rebranded as Throne in Liberty sometime during its long struggled development history. Now, initially, I had no interest in Throne because when it was first shown off, tons of people did not like what they saw. The comment section was filled with memes, people criticizing the potential pay-to-win systems Eastern MMOs are usually known for, and how the game just looked like it was built for mobile phones. I saw the initial trailer, told myself I'd check it out if I had the time, and put it in the back of my mind. Fast forward to about a week ago after the game's free-to-play launch, and I've lost nearly all of my free time playing this game. It seems like a lot of the MMO community also changed their tune. Was Throne in Liberty the smash hit all of us MMO gamers have been waiting for, or is it just a solid title in the sea of mediocre live service games we've been seeing? Well, let's talk about Throne in Liberty, and if you should give it a shot.
Now it's your time to join the battle. How will you claim your throne?
Like the first Descendants, Throne in Liberty is a cross-platform free-to-play title, so it's really easy to just jump into it. If you are on PC, simply install it via Steam and jump in-game with your Steam account. The game is also on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S, so console owners can also join in on the fun. But do keep in mind that the game does not currently support cross-progression, so once you choose a platform, you can't carry over your progress. Sort of a missed opportunity, but cross-platform is a great way to start at release, so maybe in the future they will have cross-progression. Graphically, Throne is a strong-looking title, with it being built in Unreal Engine 4. Personally, I don't think it looks as good as, say, Black Desert Online, but on max settings, Throne is a rather beautiful game to look at, and it runs relatively smoothly with no crashes occurring during the whole time I played. In terms of sound, the game honestly has a pretty stellar soundtrack. There is a lot of atmospheric tunes that play while you adventure in the wilderness or hang out in town. I was surprised by the upbeat, bombastic tracks that play during boss fights and world events to round out those atmospheric tracks as well. In terms of general sound effects and such, the cracks, slashes, and whips of the weapons feel impactful, and the guttural moans of the monsters and enemies you fight feel satisfying. Overall, the sound design is pretty good and can definitely add to the experience. The story of Throne and Liberty takes place in the world of Celestium. The world is being sieged by the Empire of the Archeum Legion, whom are looking to control the star fragments of Siliveth. Coincidentally, you play as a Starborn, someone born of the power of those star fragments, hence why you have some strange godlike powers. You become swept up in the struggle between the Archeum Legion, whom are hunting for the star fragments, and the Resistance, whom oppose the Legion. Joining the Resistance, you and in theory the thousands of other players will fight against the Empire. Anything further than that can essentially be summarized as a classic fight between the evil Empire versus the good Resistance fighters. Basically Star Wars and Lord of the Rings mixed together in a nutshell. All of this starts with jumping into game and creating your character. Character creation in Throne and Liberty occurs after the intro story cutscene, with the cinematic leading into your choice of either male or female, and then the bevy of other options at your disposal. There is hairstyles, facial sliders, body sliders, colors, presets, randomizers, and there is even a feature where you can upload a picture of yourself and the game will try and recreate your face in the creator. Overall, there is quite a lot of options here to customize your look. Once you are finished, you will then play through a rather lengthy tutorial where you are taught how to move, interact with objects, combat, weapon choices, questing, pretty much everything you will need to know. One of the biggest things I personally noticed during the tutorial is the great voice acting, but I was immediately laughing and taken out of the experience when I saw how off the mouth movements were with the dubbing.
Come on, why don't you go out and get some fresh air?
Huh?
It's admittedly pretty common though in JRPGs or non-English games anyways, so it's not a big deal. Another thing you may notice during the tutorial is how awkward the platforming is when trying to scale things vertically. Your character will sometimes jump up or scale walls automatically, but other times you'll be desperately trying to jump up to something that your character should have no problem getting up to. Other times you'll find your character getting stuck in small wedges in the environment, or will simply rubber band all over the place. Grappling onto points can also be a bit buggy as well, with certain points or angles simply having your character fall off where you were trying to grapple to. It's a bit frustrating with how janky jumping and platforming in general can be, but luckily it's not a major focus during gameplay. Once you complete the tutorial, you are dropped into the game's world where you can finally interact with other players and start on the game's main gameplay loops. The main content you'll be playing through in the beginning is the main story quest. The story quest, like in other MMORPGs, will slowly ease you into the game's more advanced features while you level up, gain equipment, and engage in the game's combat system. Before I really go any further though, I do have a big piece of advice for newer players, which everyone in the game's community will also recommend. It's a good idea to have a role or combat style in mind you want to play before advancing into the higher levels. The community emphasizes this because once you get to higher levels, it's much harder to swap your weapons and equipment, so it's really important you have some sort of idea of how you would like to play. I'll get into why this is such a difficult thing later in the video, but it's good to at least reference it now. Getting back to gameplay, let's talk about the game's combat system. Throne has a traditional tab target combat system with some slight elements of action combat. Spells and abilities are used through hotkeys placed on your bar, or in the case of if you are playing on a controller, different button combinations. Personally, I played with mouse and keyboard, but the combat didn't actually look too bad on controller either. There are the normal combat interactions like bosses having hotspots you have to avoid or specific mechanics, as well as a more interactive element with the blocking system. Enemies will have a pink circle that will indicate they are about to use an attack that will stun you or do a lot of damage. By pressing your designated block button, not only do you defend against the attack, you also get various benefits or unlock a powerful counterattack that is dependent on your weapon. I like this mechanic as it brings a more interactive element to combat that is not normally seen in tab target systems, but it can be a bit hectic to try and pay attention to during combat situations. Now, you may have noticed that during character creation you didn't choose a class. That's because Throne has a more open-ended class system that is dependent on your two weapon choices. Similar to Arcade, where you chose 3 classes and mixed all of their kits together, Throne mixes 2 weapon skill kits together to make your class. class. Currently at the time of this video, there is 7 weapon types to choose from, which are Greatsword, Sword and Shield, Wand, Longbow, Dual Crossbows, Dual Daggers, and Staff. Each combination has a class name, with there being over 20 combinations to choose from. I really liked this class system in Arcade, so as you can imagine, I really like it here in Throne. Obviously, there are more synergistic and powerful meta combinations that most of the player base will use, but for the most part, any combination is relatively viable. Beyond combat, Throne has quite a lot of content to experience that will cater to all kinds of different players. Looping back to questing, the game has a main story quest that will lay out the game's lore and storyline. Along the way, you will also find side quests you can do that will give various rewards or collectibles. Speaking of collectibles, the game has various collections that you can find while you explore. First up is the Mystic Orbs. Mystic Orbs are little points of interest you can interact with for rewards. Sometimes opening up enough orbs will then open up a Mystic Portal, which then gives even better rewards but are more hidden on the map. You do, however, need Mystic Keys to open up these orbs from doing daily quests, and the orbs aren't tracked in any menu since they technically aren't collected, they just give rewards for interacting with them. Guardians are unlockable forms you can equip that will essentially give you an ultimate ability that you can use every 10 minutes or so. Each Guardian has to be unlocked separately either from quests or various challenges. They are worth unlocking since they add a small level of customization for PvE builds. There are lore books around the world to collect that rewards currency. Other collectibles include unlockable travel forms that you can chase in content, cosmetic outfits, as well as these small little mascots called Amatoys. Amatoys are introduced relatively early in the story quest, and they are basically summonable pets that will grab items for you and throw you a small heal if you have the items for it. Collecting a lot of these little guys provides small permanent bonuses for your character, so it's a good idea to unlock as many of them as possible. Another collection feature is called the Lithograph Book, which is essentially a system that you can throw unwanted equipment into. Basically, pieces of gear you find or craft can be etched into the book, and if you complete sets of armors and weapons, you get extra material rewards that you can use. The materials you gather from content can then be used in crafting. The crafting system isn't really traditional in the sense that you would level up professions or anything. Nope, instead you have to gather materials and specific blueprints, which will then allow you to craft whatever you want. Depending on what you are trying to craft though, blueprints beyond green rarity basically have to be acquired from other players, which we'll talk about later. Throne also has 3 life skills you can level up: cooking, fishing, and expedition. Expedition is a life skill that is actually tied to your Amatoy collection. Expedition uses your little toys to collect resources every hour or so, and depending on your skill level and Amatoys, you can get increased rewards. The 2 other life skills in the game are fishing and cooking, and function pretty much how you would imagine. Fishing essentially lets you gather fish that you can cook, as well as item bags that will contain materials for crafting, and cooking lets you cook various dishes that provide important combat buffs. Hopefully in the future they add more professions to take part in, or add more to them since they are pretty basic in their current functionality. Something like the fishing boats and the naval expeditions you can do in Arcade would be a great example. One of the biggest features, however, in Throne is the incredibly robust guild system. Now, guild systems in other games generally have you creating a community of players that can help each other run content, provide perks, and maybe have a guild bank. Throne has all of those things and more, which incentivizes players to join guilds and primarily group up with those players. Playing with your guild members levels up your guild, unlocking passive perks, more content, and in general, it gives a more rewarding experience as you play Throne in Liberty. There is a lot of content that takes advantage of the guild system in this game, including dungeons and PvP. The guild system overall feeds into the game's competitive atmosphere, as well as its community, because you do have player and guild leaderboards, as well as having specific content like the milestone achievements that can really only be accomplished by top players in guilds, or if you form relationships with those players. PvP in Throne is actually pretty fun, having specific areas during certain times that will have open PvP, as well as having PvP arenas that have ranked and friendly matches. Balancing is relatively okay, with usually the biggest gripe just being that players can endlessly stun lock each other, but that could be remedied with a patch. Endgame in Throne has some various options depending on what kind of player you are. First up is the secret dungeons, which are solo boss challenges. There is currently 20 bosses to fight, each one acting as a tutorial for boss mechanics, which is a genius way to ease new players into the more advanced dungeons, and for players looking to flex their power, there is a souped up version of each boss that can be fought. If you manage to beat the hardcore version, you are rewarded with rare materials, and you are ranked on a leaderboard against other players. Some more quest content that players can enjoy are the quests you unlock during the story called contracts. Every day you are allocated 10 contracts that will have you doing various tasks. There is also weekly contracts you can pick up from vendors, as well as monsters having a small chance of dropping contracts. In terms of group content, you have dungeons, open world content, and dynamic events. Group dungeons are your standard instance dungeons you can tackle with a party of 6 players for loot. Dungeons can be ran endlessly until you run out of tokens, which you then have to wait for them to recharge each day. Then there is open world dungeons and bosses. Open world dungeons are primarily used as farming spots to get materials for crafting and progression. Open world dungeons are also time gated by currency tokens that recharge daily, so they are farmable endlessly, at least until you run out of those tokens. Open world bosses are spawned on a event timer roughly every couple of hours. Depending on what type of loot you are trying to farm, you can check out when each boss spawns and what they drop. Tying back to PvP, world bosses do have a caveat of either being fought over in PvP or being cooperative. World boss events that are PvP tend to be chaotic messes with big guilds, usually killing the ton of new players trying to kill the world boss. But thankfully they can spawn being cooperative as well. Just keep an eye on the type they spawn as if you want to avoid PvP. Dynamic events work in a similar way as open world bosses, as they can spawn as cooperative or PvP. These events will have players running specific tasks in an area for a set amount of time. Once the event ends, depending on your performance, you get rewarded with various materials. So I've been talking about all the content and what they reward, so let's finally talk about proper progression. In Throne, your character's overall power is determined by several different systems. First is your character's direct level, which maxes at 50. Leveling up provides you with one stat point that you can allocate into strength, dexterity, wisdom, and perception. Each stat influences several different parameters, which can help influence your build depending on what you want to focus on. Stat points are luckily also reset for free, at least from what I could see, so it's easy to experiment with various different stat allocations. You also get skill points as you level up that can be spent in augmenting how your skills function. Some skill perks change simple things like increasing damage or lowering its mana cost, but others can completely change how a skill functions. Skill points are also interchangeable as you see fit, and as long as you follow the story quest, you'll hit level 50 pretty quickly. Next is your equipment, skills, and weapons. Equipment is acquired from questing, loot drops from enemies, or crafted via NPC crafters. Each piece of equipment you acquire has various stats and damage parameters, giving players several different options of equipment types that may complement their build. Armor has 3 different types, being plate, leather, and cloth. Plate armor tends to have more defense and survivability. Cloth will have stats geared more towards damage, and leather has a mix of the two. Weapons also have several different variations that will offer different perks or stats, again, to diversify different player builds. Each piece of equipment or weapon can also be powered up using growth stones you get from crafting or rewarded from content. Powering up your equipment increases their overall stats, so it's something you constantly want to be dumping your resources into. Traits are also set bonus perks that armor and weapons have that can be customized to suit stats you want. Traits are another beast on their own though, requiring trait stones to change traits you don't want, level up current trait bonuses, and unlock trait slots. Basically, you can make the perfect armor and weapons you want if you put enough time and resources into them. Weapons go even a step further than just growth levels and traits with weapon mastery levels. Weapon mastery is rewarded from using your specific weapons in open world dungeons, as well as from contracts and group dungeons. Skills work in a very similar way to growing your equipment. Depending on your weapon choices, you have various skills you can place into your hotbar, with each skill also being able to be powered up using skill books, just like your equipment. Skills and equipment as they get powered up will also increase in tier from green to blue and then from blue to purple. Each colored tier requires growth items of that item type, so it gets increasingly harder to keep powering up your items. Now remember what I said at the beginning of the video, that it's a good idea to have a build of what you want to play in mind for when you hit endgame. This system is exactly why. Because equipment and skills have levels attached to them, if you ever want to switch equipment or weapons, it's hard to transfer any of the progress you made over to your new choices. Skills are especially bad for this because they require something called skill conversion books to carry your level from one skill to another. As long as you have these books, then it's not too bad to change your weapon choices, but if you run out, then you would have to level up all of your skills from scratch, and it's nearly the same for equipment. And even worse, weapon mastery levels unfortunately have no way of carrying over to another weapon, so if you choose to change, you'll have to start those levels from scratch. Arcade pretty much did the same thing for equipment, and I don't understand why they would have a system in place that makes it such a hassle to change your equipment choices. Except maybe I do. Let's talk about the game's monetization in conjunction with the community, because everything I just described intertwines with both of them. Throne and Liberty is a fully free-to-play MMORPG. There is literally nothing you can't do in the game that is paywalled. However, the game does heavily favor those who do spend money in the cash shop. First, let's talk about the cash shop in general. It has a relatively benign list of items to purchase, like cosmetics, amatoys, morphs, and the cash currency called Lucent. The other currency, called Ornate Coins, can only be earned through gameplay or given out from special promotions, so those items don't count. The game does double dip by having two passes. One is the Level Pass, that rewards items as you level up, and the Battle Pass, which rewards items from doing specific tasks. Both passes have a premium version, and both of them reward growth items that help increase your power, so players who purchase the premium versions will have a slight edge against players who do not. Now, technically, you can earn those premium passes by selling items on the auction house. You see, normal trading doesn't exist in Throne. Instead, players can sell certain items in the auction house for cash shop currency, allowing free players the ability to potentially earn cash shop items without spending any real money. The flip side here, though, is technically someone is having to spend the money to buy those items from players. And let's be real here, it allows players who spend money to buy whatever equipment they want without having to run content. I suppose it's not overly egregious, but it is power that players can buy and use to make themselves have more of an advantage in PvE content and PvP content. So yeah, it fits the definition of pay to win. Now, this potentially gets even worse when you bring up the shady community aspects that some players have been seeing on certain servers. Top guilds on some servers have been farming items and locking players out of loot through their sheer power and alliances. Guilds that constantly get drops can continuously fuel themselves by selling items on the auction house, leading to a bottlenecked server where if you are not in one of those top guilds, you are going to struggle competing against them to try and even earn cash shop currency. Luckily, this seems to be a rarity and most players just want to play cooperatively. In general, the community is pretty much like the typical MMO crowd you'll see in other popular titles. Chat is filled with constant meme culture, references, and tons of players just looking to run content. So with all the good and bad that Throne has, is it the MMORPG that tons of people have been waiting for? Does it succeed or will it fail? Honestly, it's hard to say at this point. The game does a lot of cool things that we haven't seen in a while from a modern MMORPG, but it also does a lot of bad. It's got a lot of great social features, engaging content, familiar tab target combat, along with decent graphics and music quality. On the other hand, it has some pay-to-win elements, harsh progression systems that demand a lot of your time, and some general quality issues we normally see in newly launched MMOs. If I'm being honest, the game has a lot of fun qualities to it. I've definitely had a lot of nights in the past couple weeks staying up late running content with friends and genuinely looking forward to logging in the next day. I haven't paid any attention to the naysayers online in the negative videos because, well, I've been having too much fun actually playing the game. But I've had this feeling before with Arcade Unchained during its launch. It was some of the most fun I had with an MMORPG. I can see Throne having a lot of the same problems Arcade had with its player base, where a month after the game released, a lot of the player base just couldn't keep up with the game's demanding systems. Will Throne suffer the same fate? I'm hoping it can change a lot of its shortcomings for the better, because the developers genuinely certainly seem to want to cater to the Western audience with this release, but only time will tell. Let's get to my final thoughts. Throne and Liberty is probably one of the first MMORPGs in a while that brings back the traditional MMO experience that's sort of been lacking in recent titles. I'm talking emphasis on social aspects, content that can appeal to all types of players, with PvP included, and generally, the game presents a world that is fun to explore. All of that at literally no cost, since the game is completely free to play. No membership, no purchase price. Nope, just download the game on whatever platform you favor, and you are good to go, with it being available on Steam, Xbox Series X and S, and PlayStation 5 with crossplay included. Aesthetically, the game is relatively pretty to look at, with the game's soundtrack being even better. The game has a lot of deep progression systems and customization in the way that you can build your character's combat role. There's so many things you can fine-tune, from your skills, your weapons, to your equipment. Lastly, the game has a really robust guild system that emphasizes players to join in on. There is so much content that is unlocked by playing with friends in a guild that you almost do yourself a disservice by not engaging with it. Unfortunately, with all the praises I can give Throne and Liberty, I can also give as many drawbacks. The game has a pretty harsh issue for players that may want to change weapons and builds. Once you've sunk a lot of your resources into your weapons and gear, it's really hard to change things around. Either you would be required to completely grind out everything all over again, or you are forced to essentially start a new character. The game is arguably pay to win, with players able to buy certain pieces of equipment they need, or premium systems that can reward items that will help progression. I would argue the game is really rough for casual players as well, because there are so many systems that are based on a timer. Certain pieces of content or bosses are simply not available during certain times, and some people out there are just not going to have the time to wait for those events to start. Most people will just hop on, do whatever content they can, and then log out. Currently, while the game does have quite a lot of options for build customization, there are also some balance issues with clearly definitive ways to play certain classes and weapon combinations. Lastly, it's hard to deny that the game does reward toxic behavior from its community. Players that gatekeep others out of content via PvP or scummy behavior are going to get advantages based on how some of the content works. This in general can completely turn off some players, as it can feel hopeless trying to catch up to those top players that are constantly going to get more powerful than the average player. Well, that's all of my thoughts on Throne and Liberty. It's completely taken me by surprise, considering I literally had no expectations of what I was walking into when I first started playing the game. The MMO community has generally seemed to have a positive attitude towards it now, but as I said, time will tell if the game truly establishes itself as a major competitor in the market. Anyways, what do you think about Throne and Liberty? Are you playing it? Let me know down in the comment section below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel to support my content. Follow all of my social media in the description below, and I hope to see you all next time.